Isabel Brown, a Gen Z content creator and author. Isabel, there's a New York Times Siena College poll that narrows the numbers down to just Gen Z, and that's ages 18 to 29. 49% of those voters support Trump, just 43% for Biden. So why that shift?
You know, Laura, it's incredibly exciting to see, and it's not the only polling suggesting extreme support for President Trump. Another poll dropped this week, covered by Newsweek magazine, said 64% of that age group approves of Donald Trump's performance during his first term as president. But it's really no secret. Politics, we believe, is downstream from culture. And if we zoom out to what's happening culturally in America today, we see the radical authoritarian left controlling every aspect of what it means to be an American, our education, our entertainment, our news media, our politics, our church, and everything in between. And like every young generation who came before us, we want to rebel against those in power. There was a new poll that dropped earlier today that young people are actually starting to shift in political polling away from Joe Biden and towards Donald Trump. Forget whatever you think about the political candidates. I think that's echoing the cultural shift that's been happening with Gen Z for the last several years, where young people are embracing more conservative, traditional cultural values, and obviously that's going to manifest with more conservative politics. If you look at the data and the research, depending on which poll you read, Generation Z has been found to be the most conservative generation on an issue-by-issue basis that America has seen since World War II. And Gen Z men are the most overwhelmingly conservative group of young men that we've seen in America since the 1950s. Since the 1950s. A recent survey that just came out a couple of days ago, actually, about 3 weeks ago, blew my mind on this very subject, that there is a political and cultural glimpse into America's future with Generation Z's changing views. And listen to just a few of these topics because this just might surprise you. Gen Z adults trend slightly less Republican than older Americans, but only slightly. There is not this massive canyon divide between other older people than us and Gen Z adults between trending Republican as adults or not. More than half of Gen Z teens, though, do not identify with any major political party, largely because we are voting with our values first. We are embracing conservative cultural values first, and we're not seeing that manifested in the political sphere, which is fascinating. Gen Z adults, which are the older ones among us, tend to be more liberal than older Americans, but if you go younger, Gen Z teens, the younger half of Generation Z, are far more moderate than older Americans than us, leaning far more conservative. We're going to come back to this statistic in a different study here in just a second. Gen Z women are substantially more liberal than Gen Z men. But if you go down to teenagers, Gen Z teenagers are very, very, very neck and neck conservative and liberal, men and women. So there's kind of this disenfranchisement from the American political system at large. But if you go to the issue by issue basis, Gen Z is overwhelmingly embracing conservative ideas and values. This graph went incredibly viral a couple of months ago and was talked about by almost every single right of center political pundit talking head on the podcast world. This is a share of Americans age 18 to 29 who identify as liberal. And you're starting to look at the massive gap between women and men. This is among 1,000 U.S. adults surveyed annually from 1999 to 2023. So this 40 and 25% way at the end is 2023, just a couple of months ago. Men, obviously, are trending far more conservative, while women are trending far more liberal. But it's incredibly telling to me that young women today only identify as liberal with 40% of us. 18 to 29-year-old women, only 40% of 18 to 29-year-old women are identifying as liberal. And that's like a record high, basically, with the exception of 2019, 2020. Only 25% of 18 to 29-year-old men are identifying as liberal. So the inverse, 75% of them are leaning more conservative and moderate. That's insane. And nobody wants to talk about that because it doesn't fit the narrative of Gen Z being this overwhelmingly leftist and socialist and entitled participation trophy angry generation that's destroying America. In reality, we're actually embracing some of the most traditional cultural values in modern history, putting a modern spin on them and making them our own. But we might be the last saving grace for this crazy experiment called Western civilization, even after the mistakes that were made by the people who raised us, which is absolutely fascinating to me. I actually think the data on young men and young women still has a long time to catch up as well, because even though it says young women are so overwhelmingly liberal and young men are so overwhelmingly conservative, anecdotally, what I'm seeing with young women today actually is starting to prove the opposite. And so I think a lot of the political polling has yet to catch up with the cultural shifts in society today. And obviously we know that to be true. It was the late, great Andrew Breitbart that said politics is always downstream from culture. So I always like to have my finger on the pulse upstream, what's going on culturally, and how is that going to impact politics later on. If you start looking at some of the biggest cultural issues of our time, like dating and relationships, like education, like our careers, like our faith, women are leaning far more conservatively culturally, again, forget about hat colors and the letter of the party that you vote for, but culturally than anyone is giving us credit for. And I like to tell this story all the time, but last spring I had the opportunity about a year ago to travel to Santa Barbara, California and be on the very famed Whatever podcast. I'm sure you guys have all seen clips of it. It was a really enlightening experience. If you set a boundary for a man, either intentionally or unintentionally, he will honor that boundary. For example, if you let him continue getting away with cheating on you and being half in, half out of a relationship, being a situationship for months upon months upon months without ever committing to you or wanting to put a label on things, that's a boundary that you've set, saying it's acceptable for me to be treated that way. Why wouldn't we as women demand more from the men that we're spending our lives with? But I found myself sitting around this round table speaking with women who had dramatically different points of view and world experiences than myself. Somebody was a recovering sex addict. Somebody was an active pornography actress. One girl was an OnlyFans creator. Most were these woke, progressive, liberal women from their college campuses. And I went into the experience with my guard up thinking, oh my gosh, we're going to debate. It's going to be so angry. I got to prove my point. I got to be right. We're going to own the libs, and got bought into this narrative that it was me versus them. But my guard very quickly was let down in this conversation that lasted like 5 hours. You can go watch it on my YouTube channel if you guys haven't already. But 5 hours into this conversation, I'm looking around the room and I'm realizing that throughout the entire conversation, myself and every single woman sitting around this table have all been saying the exact same thing the whole time. We might be using slightly different vocabulary, but when we went around the table and we talked about birth control, every single one of us said we wanted to quit or already had quit our hormonal birth control because it was destroying our personal health. Every single woman sitting around this table said they felt like they had been lied to by modern feminism, and they felt like they had been duped by hookup culture because it wasn't making them any happier. It wasn't making their relationship quality any better. It wasn't adding any liberation or freedom to their lives. They just felt like they were lied to buy into cheap half in, half out sexual relationships with men who didn't really care about them. And Brian, the host of the Whatever podcast, even asked all of these women, if given the opportunity, would you take the chance to date and or marry a conservative or pro-life man? And almost every single woman sitting around the table said, yes, absolutely. I would 100% consider that.
Would you date a guy who's conservative?
My boyfriend is very conservative, so yes.
Based.
I would date a conservative guy. I don't think he'd want anything to do with me.
I think as long as we align with the same core values, I think that's important.
And so I just was blown away. I was genuinely floored because I walked in thinking this was going to be some angry, vitriolic, hate-fueled debate where I would have to prove these women wrong. But I actually found myself feeling much more empathetic and sad for the many, many lies that women of our generation have bought into culturally that have then gone downstream to impact politics, like abortion policy, like whatever we want to talk about with gender politics. But upstream, we're over it. upstream, culturally, we see the lies. We acknowledge that they are lies. We can acknowledge that they are hurting our lives, that it's causing a net negative impact to society at large, and that we deserve a whole hell of a lot better than the shallow emptiness and facade that modern feminism and modern culture had to offer us.